there's another aspect or another element of the Christcuck question that I want to address, and that's the question of whether there's any worldly reward or worldly benefit for which you should be willing to risk or willing to accept eternal damnation. And the naive answer, the obvious answer, the intuitive answer is no. Eternal damnation is eternal, therefore it must be an infinite punishment. And so there shouldn't be any worldly benefit or worldly advantage that you would be willing to accept or even to risk eternal damnation in order to obtain. But that is the naive view, and it's the wrong view. And I think there have to be such benefits, or at least there could be, and that reason is time preference. Time preference is the preference for a present reward over a future reward. A present or near-term or immediate-term reward is going to be more compelling than one offered in the distant future. If I offer you $1,000 right now, or $1,000 50 years from now, the first offer is going to be a more compelling offer because of time preference. You discount the future reward by the length of time you have to wait to get it. And the same is substantially true of punishments. An immediate punishment or a near-term punishment is going to be more compelling than a distant future punishment. And so if I threaten you with like a year of imprisonment starting now or starting 50 years from now, the first threat is a lot more serious and a lot more severe than the second one. And again, that's because of time preference, or the preference for immediate rewards over future, or the preference for future punishments over immediate ones. So, how does this relate to eternal damnation? Well, consider not eternal damnation. Consider, let's say, a year's worth of damnation. Now, is there anything you would trade or anything you would seek if the cost was a year of damnation? And I can think of some that might likely be worthwhile. Saving your children from death, right? That might be worth a year of damnation. But, it doesn't really matter. The point is, if there's anything at all that you would trade for a year of damnation, then a year of damnation is not an infinitely bad punishment. It is a finitely bad punishment. And so if there's anything that's worth that, then 1 year of damnation is merely a finite bad. And if 1 year of damnation is merely a finite bad, then eternal damnation is merely a finite bad. It's not an infinite punishment, because you have to discount every subsequent year by your rate of time preference. Now, what's your rate of time preference? Let's say I offer you $100 now or $107 a year from now. Well, if you would rather take the $107, then that means your rate of time preference is less than 7%. And if I offered you $103 a year from now, and you would still rather take that than the $100, that means your rate of time preference is less than 3%. So you can assign a numerical value to this rate of time preference. And you have to discount future benefits and future costs by this rate of time preference to find their present value. Now, what does this mean for eternal damnation? Well, the sum of an infinite sequence of terms can be finite. So imagine the fractions, 1 over 2 to the nth. So that's 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16, etc., onto infinity. What's the sum of that infinite sequence of terms? Well, the sum of that is just 1. And you can understand this pretty intuitively if you think about 1/2. That's going to get you half the way from 0 to 1, and then you add 1/4, and that's going to get you half the way from 1/2 to 1, and then you add an eighth, and that's going to get you half of the way from 3/4 to 1, and then you add a 16th, and that's going to get you a half of the way from 7/8 to 1. And so every time you're having the distance to 1 each time you add another term, but you're never getting to 1. So the sum of those terms converges on 1, and so we can say that the sum of those terms equals 1. And it's an infinite sequence of terms. So the sum of an infinite sequence of terms can be finite. In this case, it's 1. How does that pertain to eternal damnation? Well, 2 years of damnation is not twice as bad as 1 year, because the second year is further in the future than the first year, and so it's a slightly less bad threat or punishment. So 2 years of damnation is slightly less than twice as bad as 1 year of damnation, and the more years you add to that sentence of damnation, the less bad each subsequent year is going to be relative to the ones before that, and that's going to be discounted by your rate of time preference. And so, what can we say about the sum of this infinite series of, let's say, this eternal damnation, this infinite series of years of damnation? Well, it's just going to be equal to the value of 1 year of damnation over your rate of time preference. So if your rate of time preference is 7%, it's 1 over 7%, or about 14.25 times. So eternal damnation is about 14.25 times as bad as 1 year of damnation if you have a rate of time preference of 7%. Now we can discount that still further if we're supposing that your sentence of damnation begins at the time of your death, which is still some time in the future. And so, it may end up being that eternal damnation starting 50 years from now is actually less bad than a year of damnation starting now. So, it's not at all the case that eternal damnation means you should never consider something, or that there's no benefit that's worth that punishment. It's a finitely bad punishment. If a year of damnation is a finitely bad punishment, then eternal damnation is a finitely bad punishment. So when these Christcucks say that, let's say racism is bad, and I've already explained why racism is a bullshit term, and it only goes one way. And, it's a morally and emotionally laden way of describing factual things that are considered to be normal and even good or healthy when anybody else does them, but it's only racism, when white people do it. So it's a bullshit term, it's a loaded term, it's an unfair, one-way term, and all of those criticisms apply. But even if you are a Christcuck and you believe that racism is a sin according to the Bible, which is, I think, maybe a pretty flimsy interpretation, or a pretty flimsy, argument, then even if you believe all that, and even if you believe you are risking eternal damnation by engaging in ethnocentric behavior, then, or having ethnocentric attitudes, then it still doesn't follow that you shouldn't do that, because you still have to look at the benefits. And if the benefits are something, enormous, like the existence, saving your own life, or the life of your children, or the life of your line, or the continuity or persistence of your line through time, those are enormous benefits. And so if you would risk a year of damnation to obtain those kind of benefits, for yourself or for your children, or your children's children, or whatever the case may be, then you should probably be willing to risk eternal damnation to secure those same benefits, or at least to consider risking eternal damnation. So, even if you believe that in eternal damnation, and you believe that you are risking eternal damnation by engaging in these attitudes or behaviors, or considering these attitudes or behaviors, that's still not an argument against it. right? There still could be some reason that's worthwhile to engage in that kind of stuff. And if you're talking about, rewards and punishments after death, these are kind of, I think these tend to be a little bit fraudulent because they're very hard to check. They're very hard to test. They're very hard to falsify these promises or warranty these kind of promises. And it's very hard to determine whether, these kind of promises are being fulfilled or these kind of threats are being fulfilled. So, you're really in kind of sketchy territory here to begin with. And, there's probably going to be some self-serving abuse in the formulation of these rewards and punishments or these threats and promises. And, maybe you shouldn't trust the people who are formulating these threats and promises wholeheartedly. But even if you believe them, that's still not a reason to, categorically rule out accepting these threats or these costs that are promised. And, the best use of these is to emphasize, natural incentives or to represent natural incentives. Like in the pagan tradition, you can live eternally through your deeds, through the honor and the glory of your deeds or through your blood, right? And those are, it's stated mythologically, the halls of Valhalla where the brave can live forever, but it maps more or less exactly to something in reality, which is that, the honor and glory of your deeds, your reputation can outlive you by quite a long time, according to the glory of your deeds, and also your blood can outlive you, by quite a long time. And so that maps to reality, and it just sort of intensifies natural incentives, or it puts natural incentives into terms that are more readily comprehensible to people. And that, I think, is a good thing. But when you're talking about, bullying people into doing something that's against their interests, or against their long-term interests, or against the long-term interests of their line, or their blood, or their progeny, and you're using these threats, these unverifiable, untestable promises and threats, in order to influence them into that kind of behavior, then it's not as helpful, and it's not as useful. And people who fall for those kind of threats and promises will be weeded out of the gene pool. And so those kind of threats and promises can't persist. They're parasitic. And parasitism is a self-limiting strategy. So, the people who are susceptible to those kinds of parasitism are going to be weeded out of the gene pool. It's like, you don't see many Cathars around. You don't see many Scopsi around. You don't see many Shakers around. These are people, religious sects, who adopted maladaptive rules. The Cathars were in favor of sodomy because they thought bringing a life into the world was sinful. And the Shakers believed in celibacy because they thought, I guess sex was sinful. And the Scopsi practiced castration for whatever reason. And, whatever their spiritual reasoning was for these doctrines and practices, biologically they weren't adaptive. And so those people didn't survive. And so those practices didn't survive. And those doctrines didn't survive. And those evaluations, those value judgments, or those scales of values that led people to make those decisions and to hold those doctrines, they didn't survive. So they don't exist anymore. And that's what's going to happen to these Christcucks if they keep cucking and they keep placing, some abstract doctrine, which is probably shady. Somebody probably made it up to influence their behavior or to manipulate their behavior in ways that are contrary to their interests. And if they keep placing these abstract doctrines above their own interests and the interests of their line and their people, etc., these Christcucks just aren't going to exist, like the Cathars don't exist, or the Shakers don't exist, or the Scopsis don't exist. And so these are weak doctrines and weak strategies. And, this fear of eternal damnation is really fallacious and also weak. And that's what I wanted to say about that.